Okay, so we are talking about trauma and PTSD. So I'm answering your questions, and during the last few weeks, we've made a number of posts requesting questions, and I've received a number of questions. But you're also welcome to post questions, and I've also received some questions. So what I'm going to do is then kick off with the first question. So the first question was about people not understanding narcissistic, your PTSD. This lady said, how can I explain PTSD to someone? Because everyone thinks it's like in the movies, and it's definitely not the way that it is for everyone. Yes, and I agree with her. It's not that way exactly for everyone. Although the clinical disorder with post-traumatic stress disorder does have specific requirements. There's a specific criteria linked to it. So in that a bunch of criteria, yes, those have to be similar when you look at, but then how people express and what criteria fits them are definitely different. So what we then find is that for yourself, my recommendation is that you explain and express your experience, but you can also note that it is different for everybody. And movies tend to dramatize and tend to do that for entertainment effects. So it's not necessarily going to be accurate, because movies aren't there to educate you necessarily. They're there to tell a story. So you then just tell your story, and then you can refer them to somebody else, like my own videos, or you can also use certain links that I will also paste some links into the chat box, where we can after this live I will post some links to great articles that you can read on post-traumatic stress disorder, so that you can maybe say to them that this has been my experience, but if you'd like to know more, you're welcome to have a look at this video, since I've got two videos on trauma that is on my YouTube, Matters of the Soul, and also this Facebook page under video. So you can go there and have a look at at understanding trauma and PTSD and how to manage it. Two separate lives that I did. So what I suggest then is that you express your experience. Obviously, if people do not show understanding, then I would also not share too much if it's not a safe space. So you also do need safety. And then there was another question, and I've had a few comments and questions on people struggling with abusive relationships, where they experience narcissistic abuse specifically. And we spoke about, I just touched on breaking that out, how you experience that battering and in a cycle of abuse. And what I was busy explaining there is that you're absorbing impact when you're in that kind of scenario, in a relationship where there's abusive behavior and you're trapped in it. That's where we look at the different types of abuse, and we see that that can be linked to what we call a chronic trauma, ongoing relentless stress that that occurs repeatedly, such as bullying, domestic violence, childhood neglect. That kind of scenario is where you experience trauma on a long-term basis. So living in such a relationship, there was a lady who asked a number of questions. The first one was, what are some of the psychological effects of narcissistic abuse, and how does it manifest in one's life? Okay, now there are a lot of it's a big answer. So I'm also going to paste a good article that I think is worth reading from Very Well Mind, and I think that this is a good it's a very good question. Now you have the general symptoms of trauma that you will most probably experience, but when we look at the effects of abuse, it's linked to trauma, but it actually warrants a whole discussion of itself. So I'm just going to touch on certain things, so that you can know that some of the symptoms will then be extremely personal and relationship based. So it'll be within a relationship context, and it will affect your ability to be in a relationship and your self-worth. So the things that you receive in a relationship will be the things that are affected. The because narcissism, when people refer to narcissism, I'd first like to say, before I answer the rest of your questions, what is narcissism? Some people might not know. It refers to a personality disorder that you will find in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5. It is described as an enduring pattern of inner experience and behavior characterized by self-centeredness, lack of empathy, and an exaggerated sense of self-importance. Now, narcissism, it's a big one, because you do get different types of narcissism. You get the exaggerated, grandiose type, where the person is very full of himself kind of thing, and has got lots of self-confidence. And then the one that is very vulnerable, and then the one that is masked as well. Sometimes the grandiosity might actually mask the vulnerability and the anxiety, and sometimes some of the vulnerability might mask that sense of self-importance. So it goes all the ways. But I must note here that sometimes some people we all exhibit traits of narcissism, but sometimes you can exhibit healthy narcissism. So, if I can use another word, healthy selfishness. So sometimes you need to say no to others who request something of you, and sometimes you should distance yourselves from a certain person or a place, because it's going to be destructive to you or negative. So there's a difference between healthy and unhealthy narcissism, and we all display that. And I think we all battle with selfishness and self-centeredness, being the center of our own world. Everything revolves around us. But when you get to the diagnostic criteria of a narcissistic personality disorder, that's where it becomes really extreme, and it occurs very rigidly, often, and it's an enduring pattern. Now, I would caution you not to diagnose somebody else just off the cuff as a narcissist, because what it does is, if you're not a professional person, it's difficult to just diagnose that person in that way. So, but and I'm not dismissing any abuse that you've experienced, but what I've found is that once you start to self-diagnose that person, then it could lead to you experiencing even more feelings of anger, but it could also, once you understand narcissistic patterns, could help you to understand what you've experienced. So I would rather go and process this with a professional, so you can understand what is it that you've experienced and what have you gone through and why, because it's clearly been traumatic. Okay, so if you've been stuck in this kind of pattern, then you will exhibit and experience traumatic effects. But I want to distinguish this from, let's say, a trauma with rape, or trauma where you were hijacked, or somebody was killed right in front of you. Some of the experiences here will be different, but you will definitely exhibit some traits of anxiety, especially once you've lived with a person that you never knew what they were going to do. There was lots of criticism and manipulation, and you could get to a place where you are now hypervigilant, you are hyper alert, you can be prone to some panic attacks, especially if you're triggered, if you re-experience or you experience something that looks similar, that triggers you, then you could experience that anxiety again. Because, but indeed, those symptoms will ease over time, and we'll look at what you need to do. Depression is something else that you will experience, because you've probably been battered with criticism and words of that have broken down your self-worth and yours, which has now affected you, and you've been gaslighted. That is when you've been told that you are wrong and you are the bad person, but you weren't actually the person who was doing the abuse, but you were being told that you're the abuser. So, and years of being manipulated will affect you in that way, and it just breaks down that sense of self, where you have worth and you know why you're here, and that you make a difference, and that you experience positive feedback from that other person, whereas now you've experienced chronic negative feedback. And another thing that exacerbates this is when you've experienced that catch-22. You've tried to be the best person possible. You've tried your best to love them and to care, but you could just never please them, or you could never just not be the bad person. So that's why you then end up feeling hopeless. And then obviously the PTSD symptoms, that being on high alert, looking out for danger, because now you were in a dangerous situation for a long time, so your fight and flight response has now been activated within you, and then you've been on the lookout for danger. So what might happen is that once you get closer to another relationship, that let's say you were married and now you're divorced, the person that was abusive to you, and then after a few months or years you've now decided you want to remarry, you want to be in another relationship, and once you get closer to that person, then you start to re-experience some of this because you're triggered, because you might feel the need now to be on guard, to protect yourself, and not to be in that same abusive situation again. So it's just because you've been almost programmed, in a sense, that once you are in a relationship and you do this, then they are going to do that. So it takes time to relearn and to start to feel safe in a relationship with that. But usually when you're with a person that does not do that, what happens is in time your brain starts to learn, oh, if this happens, then I'm no longer in danger. And what you could do there is that we will talk about what you could do, because this relates to what do you do when you are triggered, because we tend to now want to avoid things. But I just want to touch on some of the other symptoms, like your sense of self, we've said, your self-worth, because you've been broken down and brainwashed, and it's just been intense and relentless. Usually that person has never accepted responsibility, or when they did, they just did so to manipulate you again, to get you back into the cycle of abuse. And the cycle of abuse, let me just note, that is when you are you're with this person, they abuse you verbally, emotionally, sexually, economically, in any other way, relationally, family, they isolate you, or they and then you're hurt by this, and then there's this period where they either blame you for it, or they ask you for forgiveness and they promise not to do it again, or they just flatly deny it, and they do all kinds of things. And then there's the silent time, and then there's this honeymoon period where you start to think, but hey, maybe they have changed, maybe it's a bit better now that they're giving me what I need now, and then bah, the incident happens again, and then the whole cycle just continues. So you're entrapped because they somehow seem like they're going to change, but then they don't, and then there's this constant expectation, and then after a while you start to become confused and you're stuck in this, and you might struggle to forgive yourself and that person, especially if you've been wronged quite a lot, and it's also important because if you've been broken down and your self-esteem is hurt, it could also be difficult to focus on your future and your dreams. And you might also experience physical symptoms. So when, if you've had a number of, let's say, verbal and physical abusive situations, those things will now be stored as memories. So, and your body remembers, your emotions remember, your mind remembers, your thinking remembers. So you might have different kinds of areas of yourself that remember. So you will experience sudden frights, or when something drops, or your startle response, you'll be startled, or you'll just experience a ugly feeling on your stomach, or you'll feel lightheadedness. Whatever it, sometimes your body remembers when you're triggered. You might even have nightmares. You might have problems with thinking, cognitive problems, concentration, memory loss, because when we're in trauma, our brain tries to also protect us by actually forgetting some details. But it's almost like your emotional brain is remembering, but your thinking brain then finds it difficult to store memories. So it's almost like your reptilian brain, your brain stem kind of reaction that is activated. So once you're traumatized, your brain releases this surge of stress hormones, and it affects your hippocampus region. So you've got trouble storing memories and concentrating, and your emotions might go up and down, irritability, might even feel that you're distant from the world. That's called depersonalization and derealization. Nothing is real for me anymore. You start to feel disconnected from yourself. It's almost like your brain is trying to protect you from that. So and you might obviously experience trust issues in future relationships. How to heal from it is important to start to look at your own feelings again and to recognize your feelings. And this is similar now with trauma. So when you're in trauma and you want to now heal from this traumatic experience, what happens is that you need to get to the place where you can express your feelings and talk about it. And but it needs to be in a safe space where you have somebody that you trust, and usually when you've been traumatized, it's best to seek out professional help, and to also read up on it and to educate yourself, and to understand this better, to understand yourself better, like what you're doing tonight. And if it's possible, to join a support group if you've got something like that, and then lots of ways of understanding your own reactions, understanding your thoughts, your feelings. We like to say that if you write them down, you keep a journal of this experience I had today. What was the physical symptoms? What was the emotional symptoms I had? What feelings did I have? What thoughts went through my mind? So that you can start to recognize when you've been triggered and you've experienced those things. So you can hear that there's a lot to say, and I think it warrants another discussion. But I just want to see that I touch on some of it. So she asked, what does the trauma look like when it presents itself? So I think I've touched on that the traumatic symptoms and those things that you do experience and the emotions of going through such an experience. I think I've also touched on that, and then how to analyze or organize or decipher to make sense of it. And I've touched on that as well. And the idea is in therapy is for you to become aware of your thinking. Because many a times when we are stuck, we've got two types of emotions that are usually evident. We've got natural emotions and manufactured emotions. Now, natural emotions are those emotions that naturally flow as a consequence of some event. So something has happened and you feel upset, or you feel angry, or you feel afraid. Those are natural emotions. Now, a manufactured emotion is when we've got unhelpful thinking. Now, when you look at my anxiety programs, you will see I touch on unhelpful thinking. It's part of what we call cognitive behavioral therapy. And unhelpful thinking is ways of looking at the world that is rigid, usually, meaning that it's not really open to understanding the context of the situation, understanding all the different variables that were involved. It's just blaming yourself or blaming somebody else. I want to actually touch on some aspects of what we call cognitive processing therapy. I've got some notes here that I want to discuss with you. So what it does is the impact of the event, usually when we have faulty beliefs, then it affects us. Trauma affects your beliefs about yourself and other people and the world in 5 different areas. Your beliefs about safety, trust, power and control. Do I have power? Do I have control? My esteem. Do I have self-esteem? And intimacy, closeness with others. So it affects those 5 areas. And if you've had previous unhelpful thinking, then it will actually manifest through your trauma and after your trauma, because now you will use that dysfunctional thinking to also process this. So let's say, for instance, you've had dysfunctional thinking on saying that you're blaming either yourself or others or the world, but you're not really taking into you're not regarding all the factors involved. So what will then happen is that your brain will then say, and your thinking will say, but look, I'm to blame. Let's say there was an accident and you you hit a child that ran over the road, and the child's passed away, and now you're angry at yourself, and you blame yourself. You've murdered the child. So what's now happened is that you've immediately taken that thought, you've blamed yourself. So if you look, and in blaming yourself without taking the context into consideration, it was dark, the child didn't see, the child ran across the road, you didn't speed, all those other variables. But what's happened is, because you feel so upset about what's happened, you're trying to rationalize, is what people then also say, trying to make sense of it, and by doing so, you're making it a bit worse. So what we then do is we work with the way you think. But what we do with your natural feelings is we help you to express those, to feel those, and to just allow your feelings to run the natural course. And when you find that you've got, if I now apply the narcissistic abuse, if you've now you're in friendships and you're in relationships, you see your own trust issues surface, you become aware of it, and you check your thinking. Is this thought accurate? Is it realistic? Am I taking all the factors into account? Because the feeling is the one that your body is now remembering the previous thing, but this isn't necessarily what's happening in the here and now. You see, trauma, PTSD, is this incident is now happening. It's the there and then in the past that is now surfacing in the here and now. And we as therapists try to help you to experience that in the here and now in a safe place, and to allow your brain to give you those fearful thoughts and then to answer them with more balanced and realistic thoughts, so that you will do the same when you're recovering from narcissism. And then you will obviously have to allow yourself to relook your boundaries, because you might initially create very strong boundaries, and after a while you'd like to settle, so that you don't just have overly strong boundaries. Now usually when we look at safety and we look at control, all those things are affected, like I said earlier, but we try to then find balanced thinking with regards to that. Okay, I think I've said a lot on that one, so let me go over to the next question. There's a number of questions, and I want to go over to the live questions. Why does trauma and PTSD cause spiritual warfare? Courtney Wilson. Thank you, Courtney, for asking that. Now, it's also an interesting question. You're saying, why does it cause spiritual warfare? I think I'm going to answer it this way, because now, being a Christian, I regard the spiritual realm as well as accurate. And I see the spiritual realm as very influential, and we know Ephesians 6 says that the Christian is involved in spiritual battle and not really a physical battle. So our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces in the air. And we know that means that we can be under attack when we are children of God, and we are living our lives in Christ and for Christ. Then we will most definitely experience that. Now, your question says, why does it cause a spiritual warfare? Why does trauma cause? I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that, but I know that trauma can definitely hurt your faith, and it can lead you to question God. I've dealt with it in the last week in my practice, where people question God. Why was he not there? Why did he not save me? Why did he not help me? So on the one hand, trauma can be caused by the enemy that is influencing circumstances or people, but on the other hand, it can lead you to ask questions about safety. Can I trust God? Intimacy, the control. Who's in control? Is God really in control of my life? You hear the same themes. And it can cause that kind of spiritual battle for yourself, inner battle. But then there can also be a spiritual battle in the spiritual warfare realm, and that has to be dealt with in a Christian way, and that is through prayer and the Word of God and worship and loving your enemy and forgiving your enemy, those things. And what that does is it places you, because you have to be aligned with Christ and with his will, and you fight from heaven, and you fight from his finished work on the cross, and you apply his finished work through just echoing what the Holy Spirit is guiding you also to say from the Word of God, through the blood of Jesus that has been poured out for you. You are in Christ, and Christ has conquered the death and the enemy, so you then live from there. So I hope I'm answering your question correctly. And then there's one Hunley now that says, could you talk to us through triggers? Is one supposed to avoid it, to avoid the anxiety one physically experiences when faced with a trigger? It is so hard to expose oneself to a trigger and easier to avoid. That's a very good question. And there's lots to say about triggers, and I actually did a lot of reading on triggers prior to our session tonight, in preparation for the session, just trying to find the work that I read, because so triggers. So what is happening when you're triggered? I'm going to post a big, try to tell you that you've got 3 areas of your brain here that is active. We've got your frontal lobe of your brain. Just going to give you some brain talk here. The thinking brain, and then you've got the emotional brain. Let's say it's in the middle of your brain here. So now you see why God made me bold. The thinking brain, or emotional brain, and your reptilian brain here at the back. Now what those parts do is they try to protect you, and your brain works to help you. Now when a traumatic experience happens, your brain is trying to decipher what is happening now, to handle the situation, and to try and store the memories of what is happening here. But you can experience a number of things. You might sometimes remember just events in fragments, or you can remember emotions, or you can remember certain flashes, those fragments, or certain smells or sounds, or your body, feelings in your body, and then your body can try to protect you. Now what happens is when you're triggered, you can have lots of signs of it, like shaking, quivering, overwhelming emotions, difficulty breathing, body feeling like it wants to collapse. You can even feel like something is taking hold of you. You can feel like I just want to give up, or the sudden sadness overwhelms you, or the urge to just impulsively drink or use drugs, or you can even feel a shivering, or your knees knocking, or numbness, or sudden emotion that just overwhelms you. You feel that urge to run away. All the anxiety symptoms. Can you hear teeth clenching? You feel terrified, panicky. You start to feel angry. You might even experience rage or shame. Emotions that do not necessarily fit the situation that you're in there, and you might feel the urge to do something that doesn't fit the situation. You're clenching your fists, all kinds of things. Okay, so what's happening is your body is remembering. It is remembering what's happened. Now the first thing here is, yes, avoidance is what we'd like to do to try and protect ourselves, but if we avoid all of those triggers, what we're then doing is we're making it more difficult for ourselves, because avoidance just does not allow the memory to be stored. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to recognize the emotion, acknowledge the emotion. What am I feeling? There's a nice diary that you can use. I just want to see if I can find it here, so that what we can do is you can work through that and diarize what is happening to you. The first thing is you recognize what happened in the here and now today that triggered me. What was the trigger, and what was the trigger symptoms that I experienced? So and then we'd like to look at what was the feelings that I felt, what thoughts that I feel, what thoughts that I think, what went through my mind, what kind of thought, and what was the physical sensations that I got when I was triggered, and rate it on an intensity scale. Let's say 0 to 100, 100 being extremely intense, panicked, and what was happening just before the trigger, and how did I cope with that? And then what we'd like you to do is then, as you're acknowledging those symptoms, and you're acknowledging that, then what you're doing is you're actually becoming more and more aware of where you usually get triggered and why. So then, if we have unresolved emotions and they are so overwhelming, then what we'd like to do is then to work with those events in our mind, because our brain is trying to store the memory. It's trying to make sense of what happened to us. You are no longer in the dangerous situation, but your body responds as if you are there. So what we have to do then is try to take you back so that your mind can say, what is it that I'm thinking here, the feelings, and we acknowledge it, we bring it to the forefront, and we help you to experience it, and then to store it. So the best is not to just run away, but I think if exposure is indeed too traumatic, then one has to deal with that with a professional person, because otherwise your trigger becomes traumatic for you in itself. Because that's what I'm hearing. The trigger is traumatic, so it's then a double whammy. It's the initial trauma plus the trigger, and we'd like you to get to the place where you can feel and think in the here and now, and you can think about the trauma without being extremely triggered. Now, obviously, if you're going to ponder on a traumatic experience that you had, even though you've dealt with it and you continuously ponder on it, you might still re-experience some things. But we'd like it not to be so intrusive. That's the idea. And then there's another question. How do this is this person that says, good evening, I've been following the sessions. It's Tanya Erasmus. For the past few weeks, I recognize a lot of the symptoms of PTSD. How do I stand up in my authority to equip myself to learn to deal with the triggers caused by my past trauma? So there's another question on triggers. Maybe I should do some more on triggers, because I think that's a specific question. And because when we're triggered, we tend to feel very upset, because it's hard to deal with triggers, because it suddenly floods you. So what we're seeing there is that your thinking brain isn't working, your emotional brain is working in your limbic system, and your reptilian brain, your brainstem kind of thing, is working, and then we're sitting with a lot of those symptoms. So I think that I've touched on triggers now. I just want to see if there's anything else that I can mention for you on some of the notes that I've got here, so that you can work with that. The idea also for you when you're triggered is that we'd like you to work through your frontal lobe, so that you can get to the place where you think about what is happening, and not just feel and sit and be overwhelmed with the trigger, so that we can understand the feelings and sensations that we are feeling, instead of just fearing that we're unsafe, or fearing that image in our mind. But it is important to work with somebody professional, especially if the triggers, like I said, are just too hard to deal with. Let's see, there's another one. Ilani Smith says, our son was placed in safety at 14 months with extensive physical and mental trauma. He is now 8 and well adapted and doing very well, but we do find trigger points and want to learn more so we can help him. Okay, so it seems like triggers are the questions tonight, and I think it's very valid and very valuable, these questions on triggers. Now, what we'd like to look at is, does the trigger inhibit your functioning? Does it make it extremely difficult for you to function? Because if it leads to anxiety attacks and depressive spells, you're not able to function at home or work. Now, that boy is 8 years old, and he tends to exhibit PTSD kind of symptoms, where he either wets his bed, gets nightmares, soils himself, shows heightened social anxiety, separation anxiety, and difficulty concentrating, or inappropriate social behavior, or those kinds of things. Then we'd like to look at it. If he's not exhibiting any of those extreme ones, then I wouldn't be concerned about that, because the main thing there is that he has safety in the home, and he has the opposite of what he experienced in the past. And what that will do is it also reinforces the safety and the control and the esteem and the intimacy. So you are reinforcing, and you just continue building that relationship, because it's extremely important that we do experience the opposite of what we did. And that links to another question that I received. How can you be of help for somebody that has gone through a trauma? Now, the main thing that you can do when you want to help somebody that's gone through trauma is to be the safe person and to not place too much pressure on them, so that you actually re-traumatize them. Don't ask them to tell you the story if they don't want to. Be the person that just accepts them and that it's with them. Try to educate yourself on trauma and triggers, and try to assure them that you are there for them when they are triggered and when they do experience some symptoms. Try not to take it personally. If they become angry or emotional or they lash out, try to understand what is going on. Give them space. Try not to reject them and move away from them, but check in with them where they're at and what is it that they need. Usually those emotions go up and they come down and they calm down, and rethink with them. You can maybe ask questions as to, I could see that you went through this. Would you like to talk to me about what you've gone through? Would you like to explain some more, or tell me a bit more about what you've experienced? So that you can walk alongside them. Those are very important things. If you try to fix them, is what we'd say, or you try to give them lots of advice on what to do and what not to do, and this is what PTSD is, and you start to preach to them, or those are the things that will just make it worse. Or you say, you shouldn't do this, you should do that, or but if you do see them exhibiting lots of symptoms of anxiety and depression and maybe even suicide, then it's important to talk to them about your concerns and try to assist them to get to professional help. You can even go along with them to the session, but you just wait outside or whatever. You just escort them, and try to practically also help them to experience fun and positive things. And try not to say to them, no, today you're not going to cry, today you're going to laugh. No, just say to them, just create the experience. The feelings will follow. Try not to prescribe the feelings. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. Because that makes it very difficult. Okay, I'm receiving a few more questions. Just want to make sure that I'm on par here. There's Arnonel asks, can no emotion be part of anxiety? Okay, no emotion, that's where you experience the numbing. And that's a different response. It's not necessarily anxiety, but it's part of the brain's attempt to protect you. So numbing is actually a way of saying, your brain's trying to say, I don't want to feel this, because it makes it harder for me to experience this. If the numbing leads to a place where you find difficulty to now express feelings in a relationship, or you find difficulty to experience normal feelings of love and joy and those kinds of things, and you're feeling, we call it a flattened affect, or your feelings are flattened and you're numbed. And what's happening there is, then we need to look at that and maybe see at the effect that your brain is and your mind is trying to protect you too much, that we'd like to help you to process that. Otherwise it becomes almost like a freezing response. Your mind is in that fight, flight, freeze place where it is saying, don't move, it's not safe, don't connect. So you're in your sympathetic nervous system, your activated one, not in your parasympathetic nervous system. So we'd like to try to then help you to move over. And then there's another question as I'm moving to the questions here. There are questions on counseling. Yes, I do counseling, and I do online counseling as well via Zoom. Stress-related seizures is a question. Now that's a very interesting one. And you're talking about non-epileptic seizures. You're not talking about the epileptic type of seizures. Yes, that could be due to stress. I actually have a client at the moment that does deal with that. And stress-related seizures are a way, again, of your body responding to stress. So it's a reaction of feeling probably helpless and overwhelmed, and you're in a state of heightened anxiety, and your body is responding to this. Sometimes some people lose consciousness, but sometimes not. It's just a feeling of to being totally overwhelmed, and your nervous system is responding. So that again just highlights you that you're in the fight and flight response of your brain. And then what we'd like to do is look at the situation that you're experiencing. Why exactly in that context are you experiencing that? Is it due to a pattern of trauma, an incident in the past, or is it due to you're in a certain situation? As a current client of mine is in a certain situation, she's been in that situation, that chronic abuse and that chronic stress, and that's why her body is now and her brain is responding in this way, almost exhibiting the fact that she feels helpless. So we then try to see how can we empower you as well. So there's practically empowering you to get out of the situation, but then also looking at some of the trauma that you've experienced. But when you're in an abusive situation or a stressful situation and it's chronic, my first line is to try and get you out of the situation. If it's not possible, then to try and empower you as much as possible. But you will re-experience the trauma, and that's not going to work. And then there's a question: what if the environment in which you live is not a safe space? When you can't express feelings or pain because you're living in a house with people who all have issues. And yes, that is indeed now the situation that I'm describing, the chronic stress. And when you're in such a situation, what you need to do then is create a situation outside of your home environment where you do have experience love and kindness and understanding. And I used to experience a similar situation, and I created something outside of my environment where there was safety. So if you can do that, that's the role of the church. Usually is supposed to be a place of safety where you experience love, like Jesus said, love one another. That's what he said. This is my only command to you: love each other, because he knew the world was full of abuse and hurt and pain, and it's tough out there. And he said, love each other. So I would then recommend trying to find that place outside and get outside help on how to try to manage and handle the situation inside the home. Because otherwise what happens is that it becomes more and more difficult to deal with it inside the home. And then just want to read this comment from this side. What's important is here, we call it your social support network. I think that having friends and a spiritual network, what I do is I have a number of men's groups that I attend. I have cell groups. I have one-on-one mentors. I have friends, close friends, people in my life in various stages. I've got lots of support around me. I've got a wonderful wife, so I've got family, and I invest and manage those relationships very well. Not that I'm praising myself, meaning that I'm intentional in seeking out those people and in building those relationships. I was not like that in the past. I tended to self-isolate, which just worsened things rapidly. But now I'm actively trying to build that support system, and it doesn't save and buffer me against everything, but at least it makes a huge difference. I must tell you, it keeps me rational because I get feedback and I get support and I get other people's perspectives, caring people's perspectives, and that will help. So that will be my input there. And then there's how can you fix it to show your emotions to no one, not even your kids. I'm not exactly sure there what it means. I think it's relating to a previous comment made. What if you show no emotion? How can you fix it if you show no emotion, not even to your kids? Now, if you do not show any emotion, and if that's now post a trauma, if that's after a traumatic event, yes, then that might be normal for a while. If it becomes a pattern, no, then that's not healthy. If you're stuck in an abusive situation and you do not show emotion because it's not safe, then that might be the reason. If you don't show emotion to people, maybe you've learned from your childhood abuse that it's not safe to show emotion, and therefore I tend not to connect with my emotion and communicate it. and you say you don't even show it to kids, so that might just show that you are struggling to connect with your own emotion and to acknowledge it, give it a name, and that relates to safety and trust and intimacy. And there it would be helpful to try to start with the safe people in your life, to try to say what are the feelings that you can identify and that you can start to name and to talk about. Start with the safer feelings. I'm feeling happy today, I'm feeling at peace, or I'm feeling a bit worried about something, just a small thing. And slowly but surely you make it a bit more closer and more intimate and more vulnerable. So it's got to do with trust and safety. But you do need to, and if that doesn't work, if you don't have any person there, then I think therapy is the best way, because that's where we create a safe space for you so that you can do that. I see there are lots of wonderful comments, and I really do appreciate your involvement tonight. It's wonderful. Let's look at this. There's a person who says she blocks out the past and can't remember conversations. She blocks out the past and can't remember present conversations with the spouse. Now that's a very okay, blocking out the past is part of, in a sense, almost dissociating a bit. It is your brain also experiencing that fight and flight and then struggling to remember. But blocking out the past, it could be suppression, it could be repression, it could be denial, it could be a lot of things. Depends on what exactly is happening there. Meaning that something is traumatic to your mind and that you do not want to remember it because it does not feel pleasant. If it is to such a degree where you are blocking out present conversations, then we have to look at to what extent are you avoiding certain traumatic experiences, if it's indeed related to trauma. So it just shows that there is a need to work with what you're experiencing. And then there's some people who also agree that they've self-isolated. And I see there's another question here from a person that says that, Tabi Singh, that says that's my son, also 22 years old. He suffers from anxiety and depression, and they encourage him to go out. Indeed, it is, self-isolating. The dilemma with self-isolating is that once you're struggling with anxiety and depression, what happens is you remember what I said earlier on cognitive processing therapy. We tend to have unhelpful thinking. So anxiety comes and in your mind, and then it's a kind of thinking pattern that exacerbates the anxiety. So you might have anxiety due to a past experience. It might be some of your temperament, because my temperament tends to experience anxiety due to perfectionistic traits. I want to do it perfectly, and therefore I put extra pressure on myself with unrealistic expectations, which would be an unhelpful thinking style. Always expecting too much of myself. But then what we do is we have the anxiety kind of thinking will be all or nothing thinking, rigid kind of ways. Something is either black or white. It's either this or that way. I'm either good or I'm bad, or I'm doing this great or I'm pathetic, or people will like me or they will hate me, kind of thing. Or it's magnifying your negative aspects and minimizing your positives. And depression is a sense of self-worth and hope to change a situation, and hope that a situation will change, and feeling in control of a situation. That's got to do with depression. If you have those things and they've developed, let's say throughout your teenage years, you've been bullied, you're not sure of yourself, you've not really experienced a lot of success, and your self-worth is low, and you tend to be a bit more perfectionistic, then you can add to that with all the manufactured feelings by exacerbating that kind of thinking and excessive worry. So once you self-isolate, because then you start to think, but other people will say this, and you make assumptions, and you jump to conclusions. People think this of me, and you start to catastrophize, think that a catastrophe is going to happen, so make a mountain out of a molehill, and you jump ahead and you say, but people will think this of me. Or you read minds. People are thinking this of me because they are frowning, but they might be frowning because they've got a pain in their buttocks, I don't know. So people we sometimes tend to jump to all kinds of conclusions and then experience more anxiety. And once we then in that place, then we say, okay, it's better for me not to go out. And once you self-isolate, you're like a dam that says, I'm not going to allow any water to flow in, and I'm not also allowing water to flow out. So what happens with the water? It stagnates. So you don't get positive feedback, you don't get healthy criticism, you don't get support, you don't get people listening to you. You don't experience and see, hey, this person also went through something like this. It's not just me. We call that universalism. You know, your problem is universal. It's not just you experiencing it. All those things. So self-isolation, bad. Now I'm not referring to taking some me time. That's good. You know, you have to balance it again. And then there's a person who says they also struggled showing emotions because I was not allowed to as a child. Indeed, that thank you for that, Christopher. It's you know, when we sometimes raise our children, sometimes the parenting styles can be quite strict, and sometimes culture does not always understand emotions, because in order to become a healthy individual, we need to be able to label emotion. What is it that I'm feeling? Why am I feeling this? Be able to give a reason for it. And is this with that I'm feeling connected to a thought that I thought? Because if we look at rational emotive behavior therapy, we say what you think affects what you feel, affects what you do. There's a cognitive triangle. I'll post that as well on Matters of the Soul's Facebook page, so you can have a look. What we think affects what we feel and affects what we do, but what we then do sometimes also affects what we think and what we feel. So when we're not allowed as a child to express your feelings, you're either being dominated, or maybe you are neglected and nobody's checking in with you. How are you doing? Why are you feeling this? Then you try to cope with it on your own through either doing some activity or suppressing it. I suppressed my feelings as a child. I expressed it, and when it didn't work, I suppressed it, and that also didn't work. And later on, I expressed it through verbally at therapy. So that's what helped me. So what we'd like to do is to start to identify our emotions and to start to check in with ourselves every now and then throughout the day. Where am I now? What am I feeling? Why am I feeling this? And then check your thinking. Is there anything that I'm thinking that is maybe contributing or causing this feeling? Am I maybe exacerbating something, or am I jumping to a conclusion? Maybe I'm blaming myself for others without taking everything into context or regarding all the factors. So all those kinds of thinking, you can go and have a look at my video on emotions and feelings, and to try to understand yourself more. Because when you're traumatized then, and you've struggled to show emotions, now suddenly you're overwhelmed by emotions you've never really experienced before, and you've never labeled, you've never given them a name, and you've never really known how to express it. Now verbally talking about it is one of the ways, but you can draw it, you can picture, you can do artworks, you can express your feelings in a variety of ways, and you get creative ways to express it. But then you also get the alcohol abuse, the jumping on your motorcycle, racing at 250, the reckless behavior, just going and sleeping around, whatever, all those things that put you at risk. So rather try to say to yourself, my emotions aren't bad, they are my way of feeling it. And what we see in the Bible is that King David, he experienced a number of traumatic experiences. I mean, his son, he had a number of children die. He had lots of wars. And what he would do is he would go to the Lord and he would pour out his heart, is what he said. So meaning he would give either a complaint or his fear. He would express his fear. But then he would also express what he knew to be true of God and what he knew to be the facts. and how has God showed himself in the past in his life and in the other believers' lives that he knows, so that he strengthens his faith, and then he requests of God certain things. He talks to him, he expresses it in a request. So you can even write that prayer down and then reach out to others. I asked a prayer friend of mine Friday last week to pray for me. and I expressed clearly to him what the dilemma was and why, and he checked in with me today. So it's so valuable when you can lean on others as well. And then there's some more questions. I see you guys are so awake. I'm so glad you are all listening. Can anxiety and depression cause you to isolate yourself from other, like to keep? Yes, for sure, like I expressed just now, and I explained for sure, and it's not the ideal. It's actually a part of the dilemma, and it makes it worse. But now what happens is, typically with people with anxiety, is they now go and say, okay, I shouldn't self-isolate, and now they go in that between people, but then they get triggered, or they feel upset, or that because they've got manufactured feelings from unhelpful thinking. And that's why supportive friends are very important. But slowly but surely take yourself out of isolation. What I used to do is I went to a men's group, I went to church, I would sit in the back, I would go to the men's group, sit in the back, didn't interact with a lot of people in the beginning, but slowly but surely I would just greet people, allow myself to almost like to defrost, so that I can get used to it and start to feel safe. I see there's wonderful comments. There's another one. If you've lost your joy, can it be a part of anxiety? Like you feel nothing and you give fake smiles. What's happened there is that what you're experiencing there is it's more depression. It's losing your joy and giving fake smiles. That might be because you're trying to show that you're happy, but you don't really feel that. So it's not what we call congruent with what you're feeling. So, and that just means that you actually are wanting to express something else. You're wanting to say, but I am not okay, and I'm sitting with this, and I'm feeling this, and you actually need to be able to talk it through with somebody. So that, because crying about what we're experiencing and feeling those natural feelings, like I said earlier, are all healthy. And then we look at the manufactured ones, the ones that we have unhelpful thinking. But you're talking about feeling alone, actually, and wanting to connect and being real with people. Now, this is true. Sometimes, people aren't counselors, they aren't therapists and psychologists. So I found it in my life that people are very well intentioned, but they sometimes tend to not know how to deal with deeper emotions. I mean, if you break down and you cry there and you say you want to die, or you can't take it anymore, people feel overwhelmed too by hearing that, and they don't really know what to do. It's almost like somebody breaks their arm right there in front of you and the bone sticks out. You feel in a panic. You don't know what to do. You're not a doctor, so it's almost similar for them. They don't really know how to handle the situation. So we also, should have, it would be helpful if you can have empathy for that as well. But that's why I think when you're sitting with those kinds of depth of intensity of feelings, it's best to reach out for professional help. And then there's Taryn also said, I've recently stumbled across some videos about toxic parents and toxic mothers. I relate to so much because I don't want to use that fact as a tool to shift blame, but I think a lot of my trauma started when I was little. And she's talking about narcissistic and physical abuse as well. And she says she has a tendency of attracting narcissistic personality types, and now what we're looking at here is that yes, your childhood trauma could contribute to you as an adult relating more trauma and actually exacerbating the experience of trauma, or perpetuating it rather, the experience of trauma, because now you're just in another situation. And there it's important to go and look at some of what schema therapy also looks at, some of the underlying maladaptive thinking patterns and belief systems that you've developed and coping styles as to why. Because once you've experienced a traumatic childhood or a toxic mother, like you say, or a toxic parenting, it does affect you, and it affects the way you think and feel, and it affects the way you react. It does not control you, however. It doesn't control your choices. So the good news is that you do have a choice, and you have choices today, and you can reach out to the Lord, and you can reach out to other people that can help you with this, so that you can deal with that trauma. But thanks for sharing that and for being so open. So her question is, how do I approach this toxic relationship with my mother without causing any serious problems over and above the problems I already have? Now, I think what I'll do there is I'll give you a personal response as well, but that relates to boundaries as well, because with boundaries, and you can now go and have a look at the boundaries and abuse and the boundaries and families videos. Those are two videos that I do have on I've got 4 boundary videos on the YouTube and Facebook channel, so you can go and have a look, and there I explain a lot on how to deal with people that hurt you and how to set healthy boundaries with people. Because what we'd like to do is, the Lord wants us to forgive people, but forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean that we have to trust them again and allow abuse. The Lord wants us to pursue a relationship with people, but if they repeatedly either manipulate us, then we have to handle the behavior in a way. And if they are not open to handling the behavior, they don't want to hear anything about it, then necessarily we'll have to, what we call, redefine the relationship. So that means either the relationship gets more distant, there's more distance between us, or we take control and say, I will visit you here and here and here. They don't even have to know about it, but you control it. But what I've always found the Lord done with me is He helps me to protect myself, but then He always wants me to forgive and love them again. So He doesn't want me to totally withdraw. But that, and I must just caution there, that doesn't mean that when people abuse you and you're in an extremely abusive situation that you must now just continue to love them. No, that's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, have wisdom there. There needs to be counseling and guidance as well here, because you're talking about toxic relationships. But since it's your mother, it's an important relationship. So yes, I'm going to give you a more personal response as well. Okay, then there's Rochelle that says, it's sad, in some cultures you are not allowed to show emotions. Example, if a woman cry, it shows weakness. And this is what I heard from a lady the other day. And it's true. Culture, unfortunately, does not always have the latest research understanding on emotions. And that emotions and emotional expression is just natural and normal. That's why it's good to have these discussions when you're around people, and if people do see crying as a weakness, because yes, there are some people who use crying as a manipulative way or that just does not, people who do not take ownership for their lives, or people, but sometimes, mostly, crying is just a natural way of either you're feeling overwhelmed, or you're feeling exhausted, or you're feeling upset, or hurt, or sad, or angry, sad, mad. And you're just crying because you're showing it. And it's true, culture does. But we're part of culture, and we can change it from our side in the way that you live and express, and in the way that you handle it when people are around you and they cry. I love to always use those opportunities to give them empathy. And that's an important one. And then there's another one that says, where do we find support groups for women? They don't seem to exist. It's true. They are, especially in the USA, you'll find more of them. But usually, support groups are cell groups for churches, or the church that I attend have a counseling center, and they have groups. But if you do not find one, maybe you can, with the help of a professional person or a counselor, start one. That's also a possibility. That's where Terence said that. Let's start one. And then there's one that says, Angela says, so heartbreaking story of my life. Always lived in a cage around my siblings as a child, with no love but hatred. Even now as an adult, I still feel lonely, like I don't know my family, because they never gave me a chance to be who I am. That's heartbreaking. And it's true. We tend to sometimes experience a lot of hurt and pain from some people, and that can affect us a lot. And indeed, when people reject us, I think it's the hardest experience is to be rejected, because it talks about you not being wanted and worth. Now, firstly, I have to just respond there to say how your relationship with God through Jesus Christ is a relationship. It's a real relationship. And Jesus not being in the flesh with you, but in the spirit, we do need the other Christians to also love us. So when your family rejects you, it's where you have to start to lean on your Christian family. And but I go to the Lord first because He's proven His love for me at the cross, and He loves me tremendously. He says, I love you with an everlasting love. And He talks about your worth. He says, you're made in my image, and that means you're very important. You're special. I've thought about you before I created the world. I know your name. I love you personally. And He has a definite desire to be in a closer relationship with you. And since He is love, He will show Him love to you in a variety of ways. And it's about you also connecting with Him and talking to Him and inviting that and asking Him to, through His Holy Spirit, show you that love. But then my prayer is that you, if you could, then ask the Lord to also help you to connect with people so that you can start to build relationships that do show love and acceptance and kindness. But I have found one of my first relationships was a counseling relationship that I went to that gave me that, and that made a big difference for me. So it's incredible, and I hear some people who were also hurt when others. And then Christopher says the church helped him to cope. I tried suicide so many times. I was abused by a narcissist father. He killed me inside. Christopher, sorry to hear that, and that is hard. I'm so grateful the church helped you. It's part of how we get through this, is to break through that and to build new, fresh relationships. And like that cliche that says, be the change you want to see in the world. But that is the thing, is the Lord, change me and help me to love and help me to accept. And I'm not going to be perfect, but break the pattern here with me. May it end here with me, so that from henceforth that the relationships will be different. And please help me to connect with people that do show your love and that do know you personally, so that I can grow. And when we can heal from the past, and we can heal from people who has hurt us and who broke us. I relate to the Heavenly Father very strongly because He's loved me, and that's made a huge difference for me. Yes, and I must say, He loves you a lot, and He wants to affirm you. God the Father said to Jesus when He was baptized, He spoke from heaven. He says, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to Him. So He affirmed Him there. And He does the same with us. He says, you are my beloved child. And He says, come to me, receive forgiveness of your sins. Come and have that relationship restored, so you can receive that eternal life, that peace. The Holy Spirit can come and indwell you, and you can have a restored relationship with your true Father. So even if our earthly fathers hurt us, we have a Heavenly Father that He's not an angry old man with a big beard that wants to throw you with a thunderbolt. He wants to love you, and He really wants to do that for eternity. So you are precious in His sight, and He really loves you. He's either crazy, or He loves you a lot. If you send your son to die, he's either crazy or He loves. And what we've seen from all the other evidence is that He loves us. He creates a beautiful world for us to live in, and even though it's broken, we still have it here, and we have an opportunity to experience Him here in our brokenness. That leads me to just a thought of, sorry, I see Antoinette, churches have hurt you, yes. And some counselors and pastors indeed are not trained. I'm actually presenting a trauma debriefing course to some churches soon, and this can cause secondary trauma. It's true. And that she said, I love God dearly and searched for a church that understood this. Churches hurt so many women. It's true that some people come and they fix you with a quick fix with Bible verses, and they try to just, spoeg and plak, and that's not going to work. You do need to have people who have empathy and who do have wisdom and understanding and who are trained in this. Indeed, I agree. Otherwise, you can experience more trauma, and that will be terrible. So I think we've dealt with so much, and thank you for talking to me tonight, and for listening here. Um, and this is incredibly valuable that you are also joining in. And please continue to send, because we are going to have another live Q&A. Just keep it lookout for the dates, and what we will do then is sorry, I'm just seeing another comment here that I missed. Antoinette says, I'm still staying with a husband that betrayed me 30 years. I just cannot go leave him, because I feel God can heal and use us for his kingdom. But it's war at the moment. It's destroying the kids, and it's worth it. I hear that. Okay. You know, what you're saying is that it's incredibly difficult. Indeed, the Lord will sometimes wants us to stay put in a difficult situation, pray it through, work with him, change our attitudes, love our enemies, serve them, set certain loving limits and boundaries with them, say no to certain abuse, move away, and work through the difficult things. That's where you need wisdom from a counselor to also say, where should I break apart a relationship if it is extremely abusive and it hurts you? Because sometimes we do need to say no, but sometimes it is true that it is then a spiritual battle, but it is actually a battle on a number of fronts. But there you need a lot of spiritual support. You need other Christians around you to pray with you. You can't do this on your own, and you need lots of TLC from outside and people who can help you with perspective, because it's a hard one. So you need professional help as well. Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure. It was lovely spending time with you. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Taryn. I will then be talking to you soon. So God bless you, and please keep on sending some questions. Sorry, I see Erna just asked another question here. Can PTSD cause a loss of appetite? Indeed, yes. If it's part of, it can be. It can be either one of the two, too much or too little, but temporarily so. Usually. If it's a loss of appetite for months on end, obviously that's got to do with some more, that might also be a medical problem, but general loss of appetite might relate to some depression or anxiety, where it has those symptoms play a role. Okay, I'm going to end it here tonight. It's great spending time with you. Keep sending your questions, and all of the best to you. God bless. Goodbye.